Welcome to everyone who is watching. First of all, I would like to thank Luca and Ivan for organizing this exciting online conference and for inviting me to be part of it. Required reading in the schools of all small nations. The quote in the title of my paper is by Hartwig Frisch. You can see him there on the slide. Hartwig Frisch was a high-ranking member of the Danish Social Democratic Party and held several important positions in national as well as international politics from the 1930s to his death in 1950. Yet Frisch was not only a politician, he was also a classicist, classical philologist, and dealt with Thucydides several times shortly before and during the Second World War in papers and public speeches. My aim in this paper is threefold. First, I'll give you a short introduction to Frisch's biography. Then I will present the different essays and speeches in which Frisch dealt with Thucydides in a bit more detail, and I will highlight those points that betray the political topicality of his understanding of Thucydides. Finally, I'll summarize some important points about Frisch's reading. First then, Frisch's biography. Hartwig Frisch was born in 1893 into a family of school teachers and school headmasters. After finishing school, he moved to Copenhagen to study German, history, and the classical languages, and it was there in Copenhagen that Frisch underwent a remarkable change in attitudes and convictions. The boy from a religious, conservative background turned into a committed atheist and socialist, joining not only the remarkably named Socialist Student Association Catilina, but also the Danish Social Democratic Party. After graduating, Frisch first became a school teacher at prestigious Danish educational institutions. At the same time, he further pursued his scholarly and political career. In 1926, Frisch was elected to the Danish parliament, and in 1935, after a huge victory of the Social Democrats in the elections, he was appointed spokesman and chairman of the party's parliamentary group. 5 years later, things radically changed, not only for Frisch. In the early morning hours of 9 April 1940, the German Wehrmacht invaded Denmark, and the country was henceforth under German occupation. Frisch, who had been a prominent and very outspoken anti-fascist, was forced out of his positions. He stayed a member of parliament, but for the time being, his political career had come to an end. Henceforth, Frisch directed all his attention to his scholarly and academic career. Within a few months, in early 1941, he completed his doctoral dissertation, a philological historical commentary on Pseudo-Xenophon's Athenaeum Politeia that is still widely used today. With the dissertation completed and successfully defended, Frisch almost immediately was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Copenhagen. After the liberation of Denmark in May 1945, Frisch again came to political prominence. He was sent in 1945 as one of Denmark's delegates to the founding General Assembly of the United Nations in San Francisco. Finally, in 1947, he was appointed Denmark's Minister of Education and Cultural Affairs. After several months of illness, Frisch died in February 1950. Although most obituaries praised his contributions to Danish politics and culture, some criticized his role during the years of occupation, accusing him of a lack of personal integrity. Now to the second part, Frisch's reading of Thucydides. As I said before, Frisch dealt with Thucydides in several papers and speeches during the late 1930s and the 1940s. 4 of them were ultimately published, and you can see them on the list on the slide. Each of the papers presents a slightly different view of Thucydides, as Frisch each time responded to changed political backgrounds in a different way, and thus tried to make Thucydides meaningful to his readership. In this paper, I will concentrate on the two essays that were written in 39 and 40 respectively, shortly before and after the outbreak of the Second World War. These are the two first ones on the list here, and which both reflect Frisch's particular perspective on Thucydides' relevance for understanding contemporary politics. Frisch's first essay on the Athenian historian is also his major contribution, and all the subsequent essays and speeches are based on this first one. It is a paper written for a festschrift that was dedicated to Niels Möller, a Danish writer and translator of Greek drama with whom Frisch was well acquainted. Frisch was familiar with the classics in general and with Thucydides in particular from early in his life, yet he apparently needed some external impulse to engage in more detail with Thucydides' history. In the introduction to the essay, this is made explicit. Frisch there remarks that, quote, "The events of the last few months have not diminished the value of reading this Greek exclamation mark." The festschrift was published in late 39. And if we assume that Frisch wrote the essay in the first half of that year, the events of the last few months could refer to several incidents in politics and warfare. The Anschluss of Austria in March 38, the Munich Agreement of September 38, the German invasion of the Czech lands in March 39, the Italian invasion of Albania in April 39, or more specifically connected to Denmark, the German-Danish non-aggression pact of May 39. In any case, it is clear that Frisch regarded Thucydides as relevant for understanding contemporary events. In another paper, there is a further interesting remark that reveals to what extent Frisch's understanding of Thucydides was influenced by the experience of war. In early 44, he wrote a short note in a publication of the Social Democrats titled "Classical Thoughts in a Hard Time." You can see it here as the fourth item on the list. This short note, addressed at the working class youth of Denmark, was meant to be a New Year's greeting from Thucydides' workshop. What follows in Frisch's paper is 1.5 pages about Thucydides' account of the stasis at Corcyra. The most interesting part of the note is the final section, because it is there that Frisch provides some insight into his own reading history of the text. At first, he confesses, Thucydides' description of civil war seemed to him just an ordinary piece illustrating moral decline in rather sinister colors. But then, he goes on, the experience of two wars, that is, the Great War and the ongoing current one, made him realize the peculiar qualities of the text. It was, he writes, a piece of human natural history that is and will remain relevant whenever societies and their laws are under pressure. Apart from the mentioned introductory remarks, the 39 essay is almost devoid of topical remarks, and it is indeed by far the most scholarly of Frisch's treatments of Thucydides. It is, in essence, a tour de force through almost all parts of the text. On this slide, I'll give you the section headings, which hopefully can give you an idea of the essay's contents. I will leave a large part of the essay's contents aside and concentrate on those parts that most strongly reflect the political tendencies of Frisch's reading. The essay's most interesting part is probably the section on the Melian dialogue, which is here, number 5, on advantage or the so-called national interest. This section is, in effect, not much more than a long paraphrase of the arguments of both the Athenians and the Melians in Frisch's own translation. In the introductory and concluding remarks, Frisch underlines his understanding of the dialogue's overall importance. It is meant to illustrate, he argues, that the Melians were utterly wrong in their decision to show courageous opposition against the Athenians. In Frisch's view, their failure was that they didn't recognize an unchangeable fact that is central to Thucydides' understanding of political behavior. In face of much stronger opposition, a small community has no other chance than to yield, because the strong will always follow their impulse to rule by force if necessary. In Thucydides' view, Frisch argues, paraphrasing the Athenian position, justice is only a valid argument where there is at least some quality in power. The translations from Frisch's Danish are mine, so please forgive me if they are a little bumpy. Yeah. The Melians' opposition, in Frisch's view, is therefore nothing else than a futile demonstration that risks their whole existence. Thucydides, in Frisch's understanding, is far from supportive of such an attitude, but due to his keen eye for the realities of power, he has no other choice than to state this brute fact. Midway through his discussion of the Melian dialogue, Frisch inserts a highly significant remark. Thucydides' work as a whole, he says, may not be particularly suited to become popular reading, but the Melian dialogue should nevertheless become required reading in the schools of all small nations. The important phrase here, I think, is small nations. Denmark undoubtedly ranked among Europe's small nations due to its size and military and economic power. Frisch was also among those who in the 1930s tried to pursue a small state policy that should achieve a peaceful world order and act as a kind of counterweight to the great powers. Referring to small nations in the discussion of the Melian dialogue thus ties Thucydides' account and its supposed lessons to Frisch's own views about the role, duties, and possibilities of small states on the international stage. In the essay, there is a further implied analogy between 416 BC and the year 1939. In the Melian dialogue, the Melians repeatedly insist on their neutral status and voice the hope that the Spartans, their kinsmen, will come and help them. This was, Frisch writes, paraphrasing again the Athenian position, touchingly naive, because the Spartans would never assist a small state that has no own means of power at all. Without making it explicit, Frisch probably saw in the Melians' vain hope for Spartan help a parallel to Denmark's situation in the interwar period. The country's strategic and diplomatic position during the interwar period was marked by a policy that has been described as defenseless neutrality. This meant, above all, two things: voluntary disarmament and, over the course of the 1930s, hoping that Denmark's aggressive southern neighbor, Nazi Germany, would leave her political and territorial integrity untouched. Assuring Germany of Denmark's continued neutrality was a core element of the country's foreign policy during these years. Nevertheless, during the 1930s, some Danish representatives at least hoped that in case of a German attack, Britain would actively assist Denmark. Yet such hopes were nipped in the bud at the latest in 1937, when Anthony Eden told Danish representatives in London that Britain would and could do nothing in case of a German attack. And a few months after Frisch had completed the Festschrift paper, Winston Churchill, at the time First Lord of the Admiralty, told a group of Scandinavian journalists in a famous lunchtime interview that Denmark's only options, should the Germans attack, were submitting voluntarily to slavery or, a famous phrase, to go down fighting. To Frisch, I would suggest the Melians' hope that the Spartans would come and rescue them must have seemed as unrealistic and ignorant of the behavior of big powers as Danish hopes for British support. The fate of the Melians thus suggested that the worst Denmark could do under such circumstances would be to raise skepticism in Germany about Denmark's neutrality and thus to risk a suicidal confrontation that would endanger the whole of their existence. So now for Frisch's second treatment of Thucydides. In late 39, the people from the editorial staff of Socialisten, the Danish Social Democrats journal, seemed to have spotted Frisch's paper on Thucydides in the Festschrift, and they asked Frisch to write a paper for them on a similar subject. This 1940 paper, however, is markedly different from the Festschrift essay. It is not an overview of Thucydides' history and its main lessons, but effectively a comment on current world politics from the perspective of the socialist intellectual. What had happened in the meantime was that in late November 39, Russian troops had invaded Finnish territory in the so-called Winter War. To Frisch and other socialist intellectuals, not only in Denmark but throughout Western Europe, this posed a huge problem. How to explain, or to explain away, the fact that the working class had suddenly become belligerent and imperialistic. This, Frisch says, seemed to contradict Marxist interpretations of history and could, if not scientifically explained, undermine the very foundations of scientific Marxism and its interpretations of history. A solution to this riddle, Frisch says, was offered by geopolitics. This particular branch of political science had been made popular in Denmark in the 1930s, especially by Gudmund Hutt, who was professor of cultural geography at the University of Copenhagen, and who had lectured about geopolitics in a series of radio broadcasts. Geopolitics, Frisch argues, can explain why a state like Russia behaved how it did, and it was also, he stresses, nothing else than a brainchild of Marxism, and hence fully compatible with the dogmas of Marxist interpretations of history. Yet the study of geopolitics, Frisch goes on, was no invention of modernity, but had been fully understood and described already in antiquity by Thucydides. Both Marxist historiography and Thucydidean historiography, Frisch argues, share the same understanding of the purely material forces that motivate the behavior of great powers, and both are equally skeptical of ideologies and metaphysical explanations. Frisch notes, quote, "What is interesting about Thucydides' writing of history from a Marxist point of view is that it is completely devoid of any belief in higher powers. He reckons with the geographical and economic conditions and with the human interests and passions as the factors which are decisive for the course of history." Accordingly, Thucydides' description of, and these are now Frisch's words, the violent imperialism of democratic Athens perfectly illustrates and explains how and why even a democracy can, driven by materialist considerations, turn into an imperialistic aggressor. Full stop. What follows in the paper are the sections on might and right and the Milan dialogue from the Festschrift essay repeated almost verbatim. Also, in the short conclusion to the paper, Frisch not really expands on Thucydides' relevance for understanding contemporary events. All he notes is that Thucydides' insights are of utmost importance, as the problem presented there will force itself upon all historical debates in the coming years. How exactly reading Thucydides could foster insights into contemporary politics is, however, not further elucidated by Frisch. In conclusion, I would like to highlight a further particular aspect of Frisch's reading of Thucydides that has to do with his experience in international organizations. In the 1930s, Frisch had been a delegate to the League of Nations, and in this capacity, he could witness how the small nations, mostly unsuccessfully, tried to strengthen their position amidst the great powers. Like some other leading politicians from the Nordic countries, Frisch tried to support a policy of peaceful international cooperation, but the shortcomings of the League often left him disillusioned about the actual possibilities of neutral, peace-seeking countries. This disillusionment probably had some influence on his reading of Thucydides and his understanding of the text as a useful lesson for small nations in particular. His reading of the Melian dialogue is thus a welcome variation from the often quite predominant way of reading the piece as a kind of handbook for amoral superpowers. As a leading representative of a small neutral state sandwiched between great powers, Frisch regarded the Melian dialogue not primarily as an excuse note for aggressive politics, but as a lesson on what happens when states base their political reasoning on a false estimation of their true options and interests. Thank you all very much for watching.